Hello and welcome back. This is the week 4 lecture. So today I would like to get started on Reuben and Rachel by Susanna Rowson. I hope you guys got the same edition that I ordered. Just like with the Coquette, there's a really good critical intro at the beginning of this edition that I would like you guys to read. It's a bit lengthy, but it's worth it. I just think for older books like this, from older, sort of distant historical periods, good critical intros really do help a lot. They provide a lot of the historical and cultural context that you need in order to fully understand the work. And they also include some good but brief biographical information on Rowson, which is kind of necessary for us today. I don't always care a lot about author biography, but Rowson is an important figure in early American literary history, so we do need to talk about her as a person a little bit today, and then obviously we'll get into volume 1 of the novel. I'm only going to cover volume 1 today. We will save volume 2 for next week. All right, so I'm just going to cover some key ideas in the critical intro. A lot of this stuff can also be found in the week 4 overview, and then I'll cover some important things that we see in volume 1. But I want to start by kind of introducing this concept that is discussed in the intro, this idea of transatlanticism. Or you might just simply hear things being described as transatlantic. We need to think about that term a little bit because this book is transatlantic in terms of its subject matter, in terms of its plot, and in terms of some of the larger themes and motifs that might be at work here. Rowson herself, her life, is also transatlantic, and all that word means is dealing with things from, dealing with countries from both sides of the Atlantic. So this obviously makes sense if we're thinking about English colonialism in the future United States. Obviously, we're thinking about England and we're thinking about the New World. And it's important to note that Rowson's conception of America is quite large, as we see in Volume 1. We are not strictly in the future U.S. We're also briefly in South America. We spend some time in the Caribbean. So her conception of America is broad. It might almost be thought of as more hemispheric, because we're not just dealing with England and the future U.S., we're really dealing with a good portion of the Western Hemisphere, and we're dealing with different parts of the Americas, which is kind of interesting, and we'll talk more about that. So, but Rowson herself, as they discuss in the intro, she is a transatlantic figure because she was English born, but sort of American bred. So as they say, she was born in England. Her father was an officer in the British Navy. So he was stationed in Massachusetts in the years prior to the Revolution. So that's kind of important to keep in mind, I would say. Not that we need to be experts on Rowson's life, but just to kind of have a little bit of background and to maybe think about some ways that her story here might be influenced by her own life. So as they mentioned in the intro, I won't rehash all of this, but her father was sort of a popular local citizen in this coastal Massachusetts area where they lived. He was, well respected, well liked by his neighbors. He thought very favorably. The whole family did. They viewed America very favorably. After his first wife died, he married an American-born woman. So they had these conflicting loyalties because he remained loyal to the British crown, but he felt great affection for his American neighbors, and he sort of admired, much like Crevecoeur, he kind of admired the whole American project. He was just kind of interested in this in this whole new society that was kind of being formed. But of course, he remained a British subject and he remained loyal. So when the revolution broke out, even though everybody liked him, he was essentially, along with the rest of his family, placed under house arrest because, of course, the colonists could not really trust him. And I think he was sent along with his wife and children to maybe Nova Scotia, and then eventually they ended up shipped back to England. So Rowson spent some of her formative years as a child growing up in Massachusetts. Then she went back to England, sort of came of age back in England, married, started a career as an actress, a playwright. She wrote other kinds of texts, and then she came back to America as an adult in 1793. And if I'm not mistaken, I might be forgetting some details, but I think she spends most of the rest of her life living in the U.S. So, again, there's an ongoing debate about Charlotte Temple, the novel that I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, and Rowson herself. I mean, many critics and scholars consider Charlotte Temple, her famous sentimental novel, to be the first hit American novel. It was sort of the first American bestseller. It really provided a lot of templates that future sentimental novels, even like The Coquette, would sort of follow. And it was popular in both England and America, and this is where things get tricky because the novel was written. Actually, I can't remember where it was written, but it was first published in England in 1791. And by the time Rowson showed up in the U.S. in 1793, that same year, the first American edition of Charlotte Temple came out. So it was first published in London, and Rowson herself was English born, and I do think she was probably living in England, just if I'm keeping the chronology straight. She would probably have been living in England when she wrote it. But it was published in America right at the point when she returned to live in America. And again, she was an actress. She founded a theater troupe at some point. She also wrote plays. She was very involved with the stage throughout her life. But she also wrote novels. She wrote nonfiction. And then later she opened a school for young women. She was an educator. And she was also the primary breadwinner in her family because her husband, who she married back in England, but he came with her to the States, he was sort of a dissolute gambler, a musician who really couldn't hold a job and almost constantly blew their money. So she was earning most of the money. She was kind of supporting him, and she wore many hats. And of course, she was best known for Charlotte Temple, which again was very popular in England, but it was also very popular in America. So that's the book that she's best remembered for. Reuben and Rachel was published about 5 years after the first American edition of Charlotte Temple. So this novel was first published in 1798 in Boston. So it came out about 1 year after The Coquette, just to kind of orient you. So Rowson's an interesting figure. Some critics hesitate a bit to call her our first celebrated prominent American author because was she an American? It is a little complicated, not just because of her, but because of the cultural identity of a lot of Americans in the 1790s. So this is something that they discuss in the intro, and it's really important that you guys kind of understand this because it's not just true of Rowson, it's true of a lot of Americans during this time period. They would have viewed themselves as culturally English, not politically, because obviously by the 1790s the revolution was over and we were an independent nation with a very different form of government. So we would not have viewed ourselves as politically or even really economically united with England, not anymore. But culturally, a lot of Americans would have still viewed themselves as English. This is kind of a weird concept, but it makes sense if you just think about our history for a moment. Obviously, here at the dawn of the era of the early republic, we don't have a literary history really of our own. We don't have a lot of unique cultural traditions of our own, not yet. And as we've already discussed, the reasons are pretty easy to see. We were inheriting everything from Great Britain, from primarily England, but other European traditions because those cultures and those literary traditions, of course, had been around for centuries. They were very old, so we were borrowing genres, we were borrowing certain types of poetry, and even just, other stylistic elements from Europe. And of course, that makes sense. We didn't have a lot of our own yet. And in these early days of the early republic, art and culture, they weren't always the primary focus, for a lot of Americans. We were busy trying to establish our own system of government. We were busy trying to establish civic institutions. And a lot of Americans were still just trying to, maintain their farms and kind of earn a living day to day. So it took some time for an original American art and literary scene to really emerge. So we're at the very early stages of that process here. And if you guys go back to week 1 and some of those texts that we read at the very beginning of the semester, you'll remember that I talked about some of this back then when we were reading Philip Freneau, when we were reading some of these early figures who were obviously still kind of indebted to certain English forms and styles, but Freneau in particular is really interested in sort of adapting all of that stuff to America. Remember the Indian burying ground, he's very interested in Native American culture, and again, he's doing something very similar to what Ralston is doing here. He's trying to establish an American mythology, a unique American history that can be studied and sort of romanticized and enjoyed just like English history can be, just like French history, or all of these older European traditions that have been in place for a long time. So, of course, Freneau's doing that with lyric poetry, whereas Ralston's doing it here in a pretty epic novel. But they're trying to create sort of an origin myth for America. A national history, but it might be more appropriate to call it a mythology in many ways. But like Freneau, Ralston is also interested in Native Americans, and she understands that any attempt to really document the history of America is going to be very heavy on Native American history, because American history is, of course, Native American history. And if you go back far enough, of course, and if you're trying to locate some kind of ancient, sort of continuity, that's what Freneau seems interested in, is kind of investing this new country with a certain type of ancient, established sort of thing. Like trying to find a foothold, trying to establish some kind of lineage. Because, again, that would have been true in Europe, where they could trace their history, their culture, their literary history back, generations, centuries. Freneau's kind of trying to do that with this new nation, but in order to do that, he has to dive into Native American culture, Native American history. Ralston is kind of doing that too, but her style and her strategy is a bit different, as we will see. But again, just going back to this idea of cultural identity, it's kind of important to keep in mind, because Ralston certainly would have viewed herself as culturally English throughout her life, but she very much admired America. She had very glowing things to say about America, just like her father, the Navy man, had years earlier. But a lot of critics think that there's this idea of dual loyalty that runs through a lot of Ralston's fiction. And certainly her father kind of experienced that. Some people might claim that she herself experienced that, even though she was living in America after the Revolution, so things were not nearly as fraught. But there's also the figure of William Dudley, who we'll talk about a little bit more when we get into Volume 1. But, he's kidnapped by a Native American tribe. He's a descendant of an English family, kidnapped by Native Americans, becomes their chieftain, and ultimately leads them in battle against the English settlers. So he too is sort of divided. He always remains culturally English, even sort of when he's living amongst the Native Americans. I mean, he adopts some of their customs, but he also teaches them a lot of his English customs. So there's this cultural exchange that we see throughout the novel. We'll talk about that more. It's a little bit weird at times, and certainly not always very believable or realistic. But William is kind of divided between his English ancestry and his current status as sort of a Native American chief, and he marries a Native American woman. So again, we're going to experience some pretty progressive visions here of the possibility of interracial marriage, the possibility of noble Native Americans blending together with noble Europeans to create this sort of wonderful hybrid. Rowson is somewhat progressive and a little bit, more tolerant than we might expect for her time period, because she's certainly privileging Native Americans to a certain extent. But we'll see that there are some problems with that, and we're also going to see next week that her tone changes pretty drastically in Volume 2. But again, she's trying to kind of discover this history, this mythology for Americans. And if you read her preface at the beginning of the book, and you definitely should, she explicitly states that Volume 1 is written primarily to teach, school children about American history. And we can talk about how problematic that might be. And then Volume 2 is designed primarily to provide moral instruction to young women. So those are two pretty different goals. They are united in that they're both instructional. She is kind of viewing herself here as a teacher, a sort of moral guide to a certain extent, just like she would have positioned herself in Charlotte Temple. Remember, the sentimental novels were also designed to provide moral instruction. And Volume 2 reads a lot more like a sentimental novel. Volume 1 is much more historical. It's really more historical fiction. But in both volumes, she's trying to educate, but her focus does shift from history to more of a moral instruction specific to women, or just maybe young people in general, in the second volume. So we'll talk more about that later. But again, just to finish my thought on cultural identity, so this is kind of an ongoing project, and a lot of critics and scholars would argue that at the end of the 18th century, a lot of Americans felt a certain amount of apprehension, like they were happy to be free from British rule. So again, they didn't want to be united with England when it came to politics or economics, or even certain aspects of like the social structure. We had a much more egalitarian society, although not completely, as we know, but compared to England, it was more open. But when it came to culture, when it came to art, things like literature, visual art, we still look to them. We still look to England, and a lot of Americans primarily read English books, primarily enjoyed English art. So there was this apprehension, like, okay, what's going to happen now? Can we still like that stuff? Like, is it okay for us to still read English books and, buy English paintings? Or do we have to, cast all of that away too? And a lot of critics and scholars say that a lot of Rowson's work kind of suggests that at least culturally, a lot of Americans can still, quote unquote, go home again to England. Not literally, not politically, but in terms of art and culture, you can continue to kind of feel united with England in those areas. But as we will see, that changes. A lot of American writers are not content with that a couple of decades after the point we're at here. So once we get into the 19th century a little bit, we're going to see a lot of American authors basically rejecting Rowson's vision of kind of a cultural or artistic unity between the New World and the Old. And a lot of future writers will say, no, forget about them. We're going to have our own stuff. But we're not quite there yet, okay? We're still in the very early stages of the development of an American literary scene. So what Rowson is offering would have appealed to a lot of readers in the 1790s. It wouldn't have appealed as much 30 years later, as we'll see later. But, later in the semester. But in the 1790s, this is popular. This is the way a lot of Americans are thinking. Like, yeah, we're separate in a lot of these important, political and economic matters, but culturally, we still want that kinship with, the motherland, so to speak. So, yeah, just keep that in mind. And really, English cultural identity would sort of remain in place for probably at least a little while longer for a lot of Americans. We kind of have to get into the early 19th century before we start to see a major shift. But we will track that shift in the weeks to come. So hopefully that all makes sense. Let's actually jump into some of the stuff that's happening in Volume 1. So again, this is kind of a peculiar book. We have a very large cast of characters. We cover a lot of ground, and we don't even arrive in North America until near the end of Volume 1. But among all of the many other things that are happening in this narrative, one of the key sort of narrative thrusts that we see is really the reconstruction of a family genealogy. And that's largely what Volume 1, at least the first half of Volume 1, really consists of. We have our character Columbia Arundel basically trying to figure out or like retrace her family's very illustrious history. So we have this set piece that really takes up much of Volume 1. Like I said, pretty much the first half. So Columbia is probably the closest thing we have to like a protagonist in Volume 1. I mean, we meet important characters later in the volume, but we spend most of our time overall, I would say, with Columbia and her sort of extended circle, which consists of her mother, Isabel, the Inca servant woman who has followed them back to England, Cora, who followed Isabel back to England. We'll talk about that. Cora, she's kind of important in Volume 1. And then Mina, also sort of a servant, really, like a peasant girl that was white peasant girl in England who was taken in by this family, essentially to serve as the body servant or sort of the waiting the lady in waiting, or basically a female servant for the noble Columbia. So what you have to understand about Columbia is that she descends from nobility on both sides of her family. She is the granddaughter of Christopher Columbus. She's the granddaughter of Christopher Columbus's son, Ferdinando. And Ferdinando marries the Inca princess Orabella. And that union produces Isabel. And Isabel later marries Sir Thomas Arundel, an English nobleman, and that union produces Columbia. So Columbia is trying to learn more about her family. She seems to know certain things, but what she doesn't know is the full story about her father and about what her mother, Isabel, did to kind of almost get shunned from society. When the action opens, they are living in relative seclusion in some old, desolate castle. And what I want you guys to kind of notice about some of these early scenes is that this is a world dominated by women. Columbia's world is a world almost exclusively consisting of women. So again, she lives with her mother, Isabel, and then we have Mina and we have Cora, two, servant ladies who essentially wait on her, although Mina's kind of her friend too, like a confidant. They're the same age. And then the only man that's really around is Matthias, who's like some old soldier who's essentially another servant for them. He can like open the gate when, visitors come by. So this is a woman's world. And this is intentional. Again, if you read the intro, you'll see that critics and scholars think that Ralston did this very intentionally. So, as part of her vision, this is sort of a matriarchal origin story, which is part of what makes it kind of unique and worthy of contemporary study. This is kind of a matriarchal vision, and Columbia herself is a really important figure. Not so much because she's a really interesting character. I would argue that maybe she's not, really, but she's very important for what she symbolizes. She's very important as kind of a representation, really, of America. So again, Columbia is kind of this hybrid So she descends on one side of her family from Native American royalty. Again, her grandmother was a Native American princess from Peru, and her grandfather was the son of Christopher Columbus. This is, of course, a very fictionalized version of the Columbus voyages and the early days of American colonialism, essentially. So this is something that we're going to notice. We have a lot of real-life characters in this novel, but Rowson fictionalizes many of them, like Christopher Columbus, like his son, Ferdinando, who was a real person, but he did not actually marry an Inca princess. So this is what Rowson does. She takes real historical figures, but then she uses them for her own needs. I mean, she uses them for whatever her plot requires. So she'll take the real figure, but she'll fictionalize the things that this person does, or, certain aspects of the character's life. So this might seem a little weird to us, and it's certainly often very inaccurate from a strictly historical, point of view. But keep in mind, this was a pretty common genre at this point in time. So we talked about the sentimental novel as being one popular early novel genre. Well, another popular genre was historical novels. They were around in the 1700s. They continued to be popular well into the 1800s. And they were characterized often by a pretty liberal mixing of fact and fiction. Which is exactly what Rowson is doing here. So just like readers of The Coquette would have recognized the genre that Foster was using pretty much right away, readers of this novel would recognize that Rowson is writing historical fiction in Volume 1. So they wouldn't necessarily expect everything to be 100% accurate. Again, it was common in historical fiction to take, and it actually still is pretty common even today, to take real life figures, but then to fictionalize certain parts of their lives. To make up a new plot, or in some cases to make up new characters, like Columbia is not a real person. So we had this mixture of fictional characters and real characters, a mixture of real events and completely made up events, which again was pretty common in this genre. So readers would have kind of understood what Rowson was doing, and they wouldn't have expected 100% accuracy from everything that they read. But, and this is important for us today, I think we need to notice the ways that this version of history that Columbia and the readers are learning throughout the early parts of Volume 1, in many ways that's pretty similar to the version that was taught to generations of American school kids. And remember what Rowson's goal is. She's trying to educate young Americans about our history, in Volume 1 at least. So we can probably see some real issues here with the type of history that's being taught. Because clearly, we know that the version of Columbus we're getting here is not the real Columbus. And he's basically positioned as a hero, as a sort of virtuous, benevolent guy who was, ambitious, but he just wanted fame and the glory of exploration. He didn't care about riches. He didn't care, he had respect for Native Americans. I mean, that's just not true. I mean, we have historical documentation that clearly indicates that Columbus at least helped to put in motion the genocide of Native Americans that began almost immediately upon his discoveries. Now, he wasn't, implementing everything. It is true that a lot of his administrators that he left in charge were corrupt, but he was too. So we're getting a very laudatory vision of Columbus here, a version that does not square with the historical record. But remember, Rowson's trying to create a history and a mythology that Americans could be proud of. So she needed Columbus to be heroic because she wanted his whole family tree to be heroic. So that's where we come back to Columbia. Obviously, her name derives from Columbus. But you guys need to remember, and she descends from him in the book. But remember that this isn't purely a creation of Rowson's. This idea of Columbia as like a personification or a representation of America was quite common in the 18th century in both England and America. But what's important to remember was that Columbia, as sort of a figure of art, was usually imagined as a woman, which we see here, but also usually as a Native American woman. And in a lot of English art, often she would be depicted as like scantily clad and very beautiful, and often, located in some kind of forest or whatever. But in America, the figure changed over time, and she became increasingly modest in terms of her dress, and in what should come as no surprise to any of us, she became increasingly white. But what we have here with our literary version of Columbia is this hybrid, this fusion. So she descends from the Columbus family, which was Italian, really. I mean, Columbus was Italian, but his son Ferdinando had a Spanish or Portuguese mother. So European, like Iberian, Italian. Obviously, Sir Thomas Arundel is English, but as we know, she also descends from Native American royalty. So she is this hybrid or this fusion, this representation of America, the American character, at least as Rowson wants to imagine it, at least as Rowson wants to present it to her readers. So I'm going to stop part 1 here because I'm still having issues with long videos. So I'm going to stop part 1 here, and we'll pick up right here with part 2.